Good morning. My name is Alejandra Leja, and I am a CHCI Shell Public Policy Fellow. I am delighted to be with you today for the Power of Hispanic Serving Institute's breakout session. I myself graduated from a Hispanic Serving Institute at the California State University of Fresno, so I myself know how powerful these institutes can be for Hispanic students. On behalf of CHCI, it is my honor to introduce the chair for this panel, Representative Jennifer Gonzalez Colon. Congresswoman Jennifer Gonzalez Colon was elected in November of 2016 as Puerto Rico's sole representative to the United States Congress, known as a resident commissioner. Gonzalez Colon is a member of the House Committees on Transportation and Infrastructure, Science, Space and Technology, and Natural Resources in the 116th Congress and was part of the Committees of Veterans Affairs and Small Business in the 115th. Unfortunately, the panel chair is not able to attend due to a joint meeting of Congress. Now, to help us moderate this panel, we are delighted to have Deborah A. Santiago as our moderator for this session. Deborah is the co-founder and chief executive officer of Excelencia in Education, America's premier authority on efforts accelerating Latino student success in higher education. As an innovator, thought leader, and educational visionary, she has led research and advanced evidence-based practices and strategies for more than 20 years of national levels to improve educational opportunities and success to better serve Latino and all students. Please welcome our moderator, Deborah A. Santiago.
Thank you, Alejandra. Thank you all, but just Deborah's fine. You have to put the in there, that's great. It's a pleasure to be with all of you. Thank you to CHCI for inviting us to have this conversation. I think a really critical conversation about institutions of higher education that disproportionately enroll Hispanic students in our country. Over 2/3 of Latino undergraduates are enrolled at Hispanic Serving Institution. This is a construct, a political construct created by the community in the 1980s, but then codified in federal legislation in the 90s, 92. And there's been this journey of the last 27 years of trying to bring meaning to what does it mean to be an HSI, Hispanic Serving Institution. One that started with the community and identifying an approach and a definition to what we as a community and the leaders who are on this panel in trying to articulate how it adds value to our students and the kind of accountability and opportunities institutions have to make sure Latino students amongst all students are being served well with intentionality, and we're seeing the promise of investment and support to institutions to meet the promise and the commitment our students and communities have in their success. So it's with that context that we want to have an engaging conversation with our colleagues here to talk a little bit about Hispanic Serving Institutions, what we know, what challenges us, and how more we can think about the opportunity in defining what an HSI can be as we go forward to serve our community. With that, we have our distinguished colleagues who are with us here today. And what I'd like to do is to have them introduce themselves, as we have here, and make sure that in introducing yourselves, and maybe we'll just go in order here, starting with you, Elizabeth, ask you to be very succinct so we can get to the topic of conversation, your name, your organization, your affiliation, and what brings you to this topic as we start the conversation. And we'll just go in order, and then we'll start with our questions. Elizabeth.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for making it to this breakout session, and thank you for the invitation to CHCI. I'm Elizabeth Vaquera, a professor in sociology and public policy at George Washington University, but most relevant to this panel, I'm the director of the Cisneros Hispanic Leadership Institute. I've been doing research on Latino student and belonging and engagement in the United States for over almost 20 years now. And I work with Latino youth in college day in and day out. That's in a way the work that we do within the Cisneros Institute at GW mimics what a whole university could be doing to make sure that Latino youth are successful in college.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Will.
Good morning. My name is Will Del Pilar. I'm the Vice President of Higher Education at the Education Trust in Washington, D.C. And I think this conversation comes at a critical time. over the last 2 years, we've seen Latino enrollment in higher education slide significantly. After years of growth and increases in enrollment overall, Latino enrollment in higher education has decreased by 7 percentage points nationally. There are nearly 100,000 fewer Latinos enrolled in higher ed today compared to 2 years ago. But the story is much bleaker for first-time students, where nationally we see a decrease of about 13 percentage points, 20 percentage points at community colleges, and around 6 percentage points at public universities. There were already significant gaps in attainment for Latinos nationally. 11% of Latino adults have a BA, compared to around 24% of white adults. And at the associate's degree level, the gap is even larger, where just over 22% of Latinos have an associate's or higher, compared to nearly half of white adults. Attainment matters because we know that good jobs are going to folks with some level of post-secondary education. And the role of HSIs in leading the turnaround can't be understated. In 2016, and this is research from Excelencia, 15% of all degree granting Title IV eligible public and private nonprofit institutions were HSIs, but they enrolled 65% of Latino students in higher ed. If we're going to stop the slide in Latino enrollment, HSIs are going to have to lead the way.
Great, thank you, Will, appreciate that. Cristobal.
Buenos dias, Cristobal Rodriguez, Associate Dean of Equity at the Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College at Arizona State University, which is the Teachers College there is the largest public teachers college in the US. And when you think about the contributions of HSIs, particularly in educator preparation, it is definitely to note that per capita HSIs are doing more than their jobs to be part of the solution across the pipeline. And that's the hope that we can connect here is how do we prime the pipeline, how do we increase that pipeline across all areas, and particularly how do we improve it in equity through educator preparation as a key point, and other areas as it connects the dots. But happy to be here, blessed to serve.
Thank you, Cristobal. B.
Good morning, buenos dias, Beatriz Ceja Williams, and I am currently the Senior Director of Institutional Service at the U.S. Department of Education. In that role, I oversee the various divisions that administer the Minority Serving Institution programs, one of which is the Hispanic Serving Institution Division. And one of the reasons why I'm here, and as you know, the U.S. Department of Education, in essence, our work is we're either speaking and engaging the community, or we are providing incentives for institutions and for schools, districts, nonprofit organizations to look at an issue and to address the issue with federal funding that we provide. And so I'd like to just share some of the federal funding that we're providing Hispanic Serving Institutions.
Great. Thank you, Bea. Thank each of you. I want to get into a conversation with them, hopefully challenging some of our own thinking. So let me just ask those of you in the audience, how many of you here feel you're pretty knowledgeable about what HSIs are? Okay. One very sure hand, thank you, Frank. And then a couple that are kind of feel like they do have some sense of it. Well, let's get into it. And I do want to prime the pump as you listen to our colleagues. Half an hour is certainly not enough to get into this. We could have half an hour with each of our distinguished colleagues, and that's not enough. So our hope is to stimulate some thinking. We will leave time for Q&A. So please do be thinking about that as you hear some of the provocative comments that our colleagues are making, understanding that this is not intended to be exhaustive, but really to pique our interest in thinking about what more we need to be contemplating, thinking about pushing our own thinking about what HSIs can be to make sure our students, which is the ultimate goal, are served and served well. Okay? So I give you that context to make sure you have pens ready and questions at hand, even if they aren't raised by our colleagues. All right. So let's get into it. Maybe I'll start with you, Bea. You were last in talking about yourself, but first in asking the questions. We try to be around here. So we do know that Hispanic Serving Institutions, that there's often a misunderstanding about what they are and what they are not. So let me just start with a kind of softball question and ask you, Bea, to share with us kind of what's the definition of an HSI and how do we distinguish that definition with eligibility for federal funding?
Great question. And so, and thank you for that. And as you mentioned in your introduction, how HSIs began, right? It was a conversation, it was community driven, and then later it became codified. Well, then soon after becoming codified, then there was funding made available. And there was funding made available under one program called the Developing Hispanic Serving Institution. And many folks understand that program as the Title V Part A program. Currently, that program is funded at about $183 million. Now, what it means is that this pot of funding is available only to HSIs. So that means an institution must meet a specific eligibility. And so that is where we make a distinction, that in order for an institution to be funded under one of these programs, an institution must meet the demographic threshold, which is 25% full-time equivalent undergraduates that identify as Hispanic. And that's where many folks understand HSI definition to end. But again, we're distinguishing the definition and eligibility for federal funding under the Department of Education. And so eligibility, you must have that 25%, and in addition to that, you must have a high percent of needy students, and you must have a low general expenditures. And so the 25% stands. However, in order to be eligible under needy students and or the general expenditures, there are waivers that we provide institutions. Because again, the landscape of who meets HSI eligibility is changing. And we have institutions like a UC Santa Barbara, a UC Riverside, that are Research One institutions that may show up as not eligible for Title V, not because they don't have that 25%, but because they have high general expenditures. So in those instances, we may provide some waivers.
Right. Thank you, Bea. And this is a good opportunity to raise, and I think similar to the point Will was raising, we have 559 institutions of the 4,000 that hit that 25% undergraduate FTE threshold. But Title V is a competitive grant, right? So being an HSI doesn't guarantee you anything. You still have to apply for eligibility.
Correct.
You still have to apply for a grant.
Correct.
In order to get it.
Yes.
And that's important for those of you that work in policy, because this is not a given as opposed to some of our fine colleagues at HBCUs, historically black colleges and universities, or tribal colleges and universities, which is a finite number, will never change. HSIs, there were 189 27 years ago, 559, a drop of 10 from last year. To Will's point of the numbers of Latinos dropping. I'd see your hand raised. Will, you want to comment on that?
I was just going to say regarding the Title V institutions and the competitive process,
Please.
we also have to realize that 4 years and 2 years are competing against each other. So there isn't a separate pool of dollars for 2-year institutions or 4-year institutions. They're all competing. So imagine a community college, like, I don't know, local community college in Virginia competing against the University of California at Berkeley, right? They have very different resources and bring very different resources to bear institutionally and even putting together that grant application. And so the process disadvantages those institutions with less resources. They could actually use more of the resources to benefit students. And so I do think that's an important distinction, especially from a policy perspective, because these institutions are competing against each other for these resources. And in a time when there are scarce resources, having additional funds at a community college can be the difference between a student graduating or not graduating.
You said a powerful context because you talk about infrastructure 2-year, 4-year. So from the work that you all have done at Trust, and from your own perspective, Will, what are the kind of differentiating points above and beyond sector, which you've just talked about, type and control, that we need to be thinking about to better understand HSIs and the opportunity we have in policy?
Yeah, I think we need to be investing significantly in minority serving institutions generally. We did some research recently and we were looking at infrastructure expenses, and what we identified was that public 4-year institutions spend over $36.7 billion on infrastructure, with over 78% of these dollars being spent at non-HSIs. Think about it this way. If we're thinking about per student expenditures, HSI spend around $3,700 on infrastructure. Per FTE, at HBCUs, they spend around $4,600, and at non-MSIs, they spend around $5,600. We are investing more in every other type of students than we are in Latino students. That means you have less access to labs. That means you have less access to Wi-Fi. That means you have less access to technology, to all of the things that are critical to make us successful and competitive in this in the job market. Yeah. You just have less access to it. We would need to spend an additional $847 per FTE annually to close the gap at HSIs, or an additional $580 million per year. And so to me, like, when we think about the size of the federal budget, that's actually a closable gap. That is something that could be done, but we're just investing less in Latino students.
Yeah, that's important as we think about especially when it's a competitive grant, and other federal agencies also have funds. It's not just the Department of Ed and not just developing HSIs, but we still see your analysis shows big picture, not just about Title V and the investment, especially since disproportionately Latinos are at HSIs compared to our other communities and colleagues where it is more spread out. So the opportunity to invest limited resources is even more concentrated here, right, Will? In that vein, so Will was talking a little bit about students. So Elizabeth, you mentioned part of your work at Cisneros Institute really is about working with students, even though you're at a predominantly white institution, not an HSI. So just from your perspective in working with students all these years, what do you think institutions need to be doing to more explicitly and intentionally serve Latino students?
And thank you for the question. And this is something I wanted to pick up and continue the conversation that he started, because once these institutions get money, sorry, well, I think we might be.
You're emphasizing your point.
We're emphasizing your point.
Yeah.
These organizations, universities, do not necessarily need to show that this money is helping Latino students themselves. It's the money that they receive is to improve the work that they are doing, but not necessarily is to show, or they need to show that it's improving the quality of education, the outcomes of Latinos themselves. So it's for the institution as a whole. So that's something important to have into consideration, because one of the things that students, Latino students or institutions serving Latinos need to keep in mind is what resources we make available to these students. In particular, we know that Latinos are more likely to be the first in their family to attend college. They have, in many cases, they come from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. So that has to be taken into consideration by these organizations, whether HSIs or any other university. We tend to forget that or not take that into consideration in some places, and we treat all our students the same. The opportunity that we have here to learn from HSIs, to learn for those of us that work with Latino students, is the importance of bringing a culturally competent approach to working with Latinos. Families, for example, are very important. So once we do practice and we do things, these things need to be in consideration. One thing that sociologists have coined the term is the idea of the hidden curriculum. We know that Latino youth, Latino students are more likely to miss out on it. What do I mean by the hidden curriculum? The importance of studying abroad, for example, career exploration, internships, paid internships. So that's what we can do. Those of us working with Latino students, as I was saying, in HSIs or in organizations like mine that work with Latino students in a PWI in my case, we need to keep those things in mind. What is going to be most productive? What are they going to be taken? What is going to push them to the next level that they need or that they might not find by themselves because they don't have that cultural or human capital in their family. So that's a lot of the work that we do, helping them with career exploration, knowledge about internships, figuring out other sources of finance, of funding, of scholarship, etc. So figuring out what are the specific hurdles, and particularly from a cultural perspective, that might be different from those that Latino students might be facing.
Thank you. Let me be clear about this too, and then I do want to jump to you, Cristobal, but when you're talking culture, you're not talking about Latino culture, you're talking about the institutional culture and higher education culture. That's the part, because too often in public policy we hear it said our culture, Latino culture is the problem, which
no, it's
beyond infuriating me because it's not like
It's our policy,
Yeah,
actually.
I'm sorry, I'm not supposed to talk, but yes, that's right. I think that, but the distinction is really important.
It is
And in that vein, Cristobal, we had talked a little bit about, and you mentioned preparing teachers, but also that educational pathway for our students that start in K-12 and before, because we know parents are the first teachers of all of our students, right? But from your perspective, what is that role? What does the educational pathway look like? And how critical is it to make sure our teachers are prepared to serve these students well?
I'm going to connect the dots to tie
Please.
it back to the importance of this infrastructure investment. ASU would pride itself right now, especially Michael Crow with the New American University vision, has said we reflect the U.S. demographic in schools, right? Which is great. I mean, we are essentially reflective as a U.S. institution, as one of the largest public institutions in the U.S. We have about 80,000 degree-seeking students and about 120,000 when you start including non-degree-seeking students. Last Friday, we graduated almost 4,000 Latino students across all degrees, which is amazing. Now, when you start doing the math and say, okay, so we're now reflective of US demographics, but in our context of the state as a state public institution, our Latino demographic percentage is only about half of the state's K-12 demographic. So this conversation of investing is critically important, because when you look at the context of most HSIs, they're serving communities that are majority, that are Latino school districts, that are Latino high schools, and yet half or less than half does that show up on their university campus or college campuses. So 25% is always a question as to, well, is 25%, it's not enough, because we have to acknowledge HBCUs who do amazing jobs when it comes to the work. And you're only talking about 25%, yeah, but the context, the pathway has to be always continuously examined. We're only about a half of the percentage of students at our institution than that in the K-12 system in the state of Arizona. We have a lot of work to do. Now, we are working, as we're now 25% at ASU, to make that investment.
You just hit
in
that
our
2 years
infrastructure.
ago.
We just hit that.
Yeah.
To look at why should we be investing in all HSIs to connect these dots, and to, at the same time, I believe we should be held accountable to ensure that the pathway reflects at our institutions. 25% at your campus is going to probably most likely be 50% in your K-12 schools in your surrounding area or more.
Right.
Those are Latino communities. So those are Latino schools. We need to improve that pathway. And that starts also with us as institutions of higher ed to connect the dots in a way that we're critically preparing our educators to ensure that there's equitable practice around college and career readiness, which we see extreme segregation, extreme different stories. Largest school district in Arizona, their calculus enrollment is 2/3 white, but their alternative schools, which are primarily GED, are 2/3 Latino, when Latino students in that district are 45% of the school's population, and white students are 43%. You see two different stories in a very highly segregated context, and you can take that to basically anywhere across the US. There are huge inequities, there are huge demographics that really tell us two different stories when it comes to access and equity for our Latino communities. So it's something we have to improve on in connecting the dots and how we critically prepare all of our educators throughout the system. Even it starts from preschool all the way through the higher ed system, to ensure that we're moving ourselves infrastructurally, systemically, to improve equity.
Right. So I would go ahead and jump in, and then I'll give a comment.
Just to make a point around the pathway, if we really want to address the pathway, then we need to start investing more equitably in K-12 education. We can't expect the student to show up at an HSI and be successful because they got there, right? We did some research a couple years ago, and what we found was that nationally we invest $1,200 less per year on low-income students than we do on wealthier students, and we invest nearly $2,000 less on black and brown students than we do on white students. That's annually. So over 12 years, we're talking about $24,000 less. Then we send these same students onto institutions like HSIs or community colleges, and we say, why didn't they succeed? And then we fund those institutions more poorly than we fund predominantly white institutions, right? And so then we expect HSIs, we expect HBCUs, we expect MSIs to do magic when we've underinvested in these students throughout their educational pathway. And so if we're going to address the pathway, we need to invest equitably. And we're not doing that at the federal level, and we're not doing that at the state level.
Right.
Despite that, they do magic.
Yes,
But
but
imagine if we
that shouldn't
prepared them
have to
equally.
do that as the norm, right?
Yeah.
I do think this is a distinction, thank you, Cristobal and Will, but part of this is the clarity that, you can become an HSI because of demography and geography and not intentionality and impact. And you show that, but it's also identifying these gaps. What are you hearing from the folks on this panel is that we've all been doing a lot of research. We can articulate very clearly what the gaps are, whether it's enrollment and numbers, community representation and census, funding and investment. And all that has to combine to create this plan of action of which HSIs can be core, but we know that there's some institutions that are only HSI because of demography and geography, and not because they're owning what that is. Elizabeth, yeah.
And you've talked about that, and your research shows that about only 200 from the almost 600 HSIs are showing that intentionality. So there's a lot of work to be done to that respect. And in that regard, and going back to infrastructure funding, there's a lot more to be done, because just counting 25% of students being Latinos, well, what about faculty? Shouldn't universities also think about, bringing more diverse faculty? We know the difference, particularly in K through 12, that it makes for children having teachers that look like them, right? So it's not different in college. And we see that a lot for those of us that work with Latinos, Latino youth in college, when they see a professor that looks like them, how much that changes their world. Well, that doesn't stop in K through 12, it continues in college. And I can tell you from experience, we see reversing situations in which students that want to quit college, once they meet a faculty member that looks like them, that's what compels them to stay.
Yeah.
So something as simple or as complicated as having faculty of color, faculty that looks like these students, is going to make a difference. So if we are talking about faculty, that's where institutions can make commitments to cluster hires, for example. And it's not only faculty. What about counselors? Counselors that are bicultural, that they are bilingual. What about career counselors, etc.? So we can think at all levels of these institutions how that shift needs to happen. So only counting on undergraduate population is not enough.
Thanks. Just a second. Well, let me just ask those of you in the room, because, got to keep you engaged as well, so you get to questions. How many of you, as you reflect on your collegiate experience, had a faculty member who was Latino? Let's see a show of hands. Maybe a little more than half the room, right? So let me ask a deeper question. Any of you that had Latino faculty that were not in the language department? Oh, okay. I got so a little less than half this time. Okay, that's not to denigrate that at all, but also the assumption about the concentrated representation in areas like in Spanish language or others, and not necessarily in disciplines like sociology and others where we've got folks here. Thank you. Will, you want to jump in, and then I want to get to B.
Yeah, I was just going to say real quick that we're privileged to have 2 Latino faculty sitting on the stage. We did some research a couple years ago, and we found that there were over 847 institutions that didn't have 1 Latino faculty on the tenure track, assistant faculty, anywhere on the college. So there's 4,000 institutions of higher education, and almost 900 didn't have a single Latino faculty. Maybe if you want to be Hispanic Serving Institution, you should be a Hispanic hiring institution as well.
That's right. And that's right. Go ahead.
To add to this point, this is a great plug for the Seal of Excelencia, that ASU was one of the first institutions to receive the Seal of Excellence. It was about measuring these different dimensions of intentionality, faculty, alignment to alumni, alignment to governance, alignment to policy, students, and so on. But what was big for us at ASU in 2014, prior to me obviously going there, is that we changed our charter, our mission, to be measured by those who we include and how they succeed. And that's a great starting point for any institution at any level to start thinking about how are we measuring ourselves by faculty, by students, by alumni, by governance, by policies. When you start thinking of the systemic nature of all of this, that's the question of how we should be measuring ourselves.
Right, yes. And just as you talk about the Seal of Excellencia, this is something that Excellencia in Education created for the reasons that we've all articulated here. I'm going to get to you in a second, B, but we're really taking a look at, are you looking at enrollment, retention, transfer, financial aid, faculty staff representation, and completion? And there are elements that go way beyond just enrolling students to say, how are you intentionally serving? And can you manifest that in what you can control as an institution to make sure there's a student-centered focus and attention. That's the seal of excelencia, because we kept hearing people talk about enrollment, but they weren't doing anything differently. And they weren't articulating, because you don't have to, as Elizabeth said, take that federal money. You don't have to serve any student specifically. It's looking at the institutional capacity broadly. So there's opportunities for, we're going to get into more accountability in this discussion. But I want to pitch it to you, Bea, because you've been patient as we've been having some of these conversations. We talked about Title V and institutions getting money. That is about institutional capacity building. It isn't about student success directly, but what are the kinds of things that institutions, HSIs, are investing in that you think can shed some more light about the opportunity to be intentional in serving Latino students?
Well, definitely I'll touch on that, but
Yeah.
I will say that you've done a lot of work in getting the message out about serving Hispanic students. And so I will say that we have seen a lot more grant applications that are aligned to the framework of what does leadership look like at the institution, what are the practices happening at the institutions, how are students being served. Again, we have higher number of HSIs, and and while we do have a 183 million, we're definitely not funding all the HSIs. So some of the programs that we are seeing and some of the shifts that we're seeing is that a lot of these institutions are moving away from what we call these boutique programs, right? Where there's an individual who's very charismatic and provides a program for a group of students. And when that individual leaves that campus, so does the program. And so we are really looking at the applications that we fund and the institutions that we fund and asking the questions, how is the institution shifting its culture to serve Latino students? And so we're seeing investments in the infrastructure. We're seeing investments in endowments. That is an allowable activity. So we're seeing endowment investments increase. We've also seen increases in the use of funds to improve the labs. We have also seen investments in creating those pathways that you've spoken about. We've also seen investments in teacher preparation programs and technology. Especially around the last 2 years, there's been a lot of investment in updating the Wi-Fi, updating a lot of the technology systems on these campuses. So that's where we're seeing the shift from a boutique program for a set of students to more of an institutional investment.
Right. Which we hope can align to student success.
Exactly.
And moreover, right? I think some of the analysis we showed about 2/3 of money was going to faculty curriculum development, which if you know is core, as Elizabeth was saying, and Cristobal, and student support services. And what does it look like with a more culturally responsive strategy and approach than not, which is interesting. But at the end of the day, let's be frank, Title V money is maybe 1% of an institution's budget, maybe.
And that's if you receive a Title V grant, right? Again, it's competitive.
Yeah.
Not everyone
I think
gets
about a
that.
third of HSIs have ever
Yeah,
gotten
not
funding,
everyone
so it's
gets
not
this
even
funding.
Yeah, good, okay. So hopefully this is a lot of sparking ideas and thoughts and questions that you'll have of our good colleagues. I'm gonna continue here. I think we're doing okay on time. Thank you guys for being so succinct. Hopefully getting you some thoughts here. We're gonna be having you line up. I don't know where. Are we gonna be lining up to get questions going? Oh, yeah, they're gonna have the mic out. Okay, good.
Let me add just one thing.
Please.
Back when I was in New Mexico State as faculty before coming to Howard for 7 years, one of the things I did, I called out my institution back then, New Mexico State University, as a faculty member and alumnus, because they hadn't applied for Title V funding in years. In fact, the community colleges that were tied to New Mexico State had applied and received HSI funding, but not the main campus. And it wasn't just like for 1 or 2, it was for about 5 years. There was no application, no interest, no support. There's this kind of idea that accountability that the community should hold their institutions accountable. And I think we've seen a lot of campuses where there's faculty leadership coordinating with staff to advocate for such investments and efforts, but it also starts with institutions of higher ed turning, essentially the community turning to their administrator saying, where are we, and then owning up and being answerable as an HSI. and ensuring that we're serving and moving towards that. Because there's a lot of institutions, sadly, that intentionally are not wanting
right.
to be an HSI.
That's right. I think that's part of what we've seen is that, of the 559, frankly, if 200 can show intentionality in serving, I think that's a lot.
Now, let me add, because I know there's going to be a New Mexico State colleague out there who says, wait, well, now we're doing this. But it took that conversation, that tough conversation.
Yeah, that's right. You were saying, go ahead, Elizabeth.
I just wanted to add to what you're saying. It's like someone needs to be there and ask that question. And how do we get HSIs to, put themselves out there, ask for that funding, and change their own internal policies of the organization by having Latinos in committees, among the faculty, among the administrators. So one thing why do we care so much? Because that pipeline needs to be thickened. It needs to be less leaky, and there has to be more people, more youth, that they go into grad school, that they go into becoming professors, administrators, and they bring those hard questions, and those questions that will help with creating that, pipeline, making it thicker, as I was saying. We're talking about social justice here at the end of the day. Okay?
Right. And yet, with those few faculty members, of which 2, as Will pointed out here, that additional responsibility, the unfunded expectations, that's not part of your tenure process or others, to help serve community, to keep pushing. I was being the bad guy. I was having to push for what's happening to our community. Where are we? Tener las ganas, we have to keep pushing. It's really always on us. And I don't know if that's always fair, but that's real, all right? And those of you in DC have that same reality. We have that context. Always, we have ours. Is to serve our community and how we can advocate, and that responsibility we have. So we've only scratched the surface, each of our colleagues here, of really critical issues that we need to address as we look at HSIs. We have a couple minutes before we get into the Q&A, so I hope you're thinking about questions. We'll have you raise your hand and we'll call on you. Somebody will run around with a mic. But I do want to get to each of you and ask each of you to share. You've given a little bit of context: infrastructure, investment and support, the representation, pipeline and pathways. If you could give us as policy folks, I'm going to ask you to give me one thing, because hopefully we'll get some questions to get more, but an actionable thing, right? We don't want to just talk esoterically about HSIs. What can we concretely do right now as a body that's involved in public policy, and maybe some funders, to make sure that our institutions are intentionally serving our students? I'm going to start with you, Elizabeth, and just go down the line. And I appreciate you have to give this the context that's appropriate, given that you are a civil servant. But Elizabeth, one thing, and know that hopefully people will ask questions. If not, I'll get back to you about it.
Okay. I'll say one. It might not be. I'll go back to what I was just saying. We need diversity. So the diverse voice at the tables, at those tables that make decisions for the institutions. As simple as that.
So at HSIs, we need diversity and specifically Hispanic representation.
In this case, of course, yeah.
Okay.
So we cannot have an HSI in which decisions are made without Latinos.
Amen, sister. Okay, Will.
All right, so I'm going to cheat. I'm going to maybe throw out a couple. One is we should double the Pell Grant.
I'm going to let you do 2, but if not, I'll come back to you.
We should double the Pell Grant. We know that Latinos overwhelmingly come from low-income households.
That's right.
We know that the Pell Grant has not kept pace with the cost of higher education in this country. If we're going to equitably serve low-income students, then we need to invest more in the schools and the students who are enrolling. Number 2, we need to increase the pool of dollars that is available to HSIs. The Center for American Progress did some research, and they said they did an analysis, and if we were to fund Latino students at HSIs at half the level of HBCUs, we would need to put an additional $2 billion into that program. We're underfunding it. And then the last thing is we invest in infrastructure. That's it. Sorry.
No, I appreciate that. I'll give you that because you were fast. Hopefully that's provocative to each of you in there. Cristobal.
Systemic inequities require complex solutions, but I will focus on one particular area, and that is in educator preparation. We know minority serving institutions are doing more than their fair share. That means a few years ago there was a great effort by the Learning Policy Institute that was initiating essentially what was called the Professional Prep Act, Preparation and Recruitment of Educators Preparation Act. And what it was trying to do is to incentivize, particularly at minority serving institutions, at HSIs, with additional dollars when it came to preparing educators, to incentivize that we need to diversify our pool, that we need to address curriculum, we need to do a number of things in that area. But one thing that I also saw as an opportunity for policy and tied to Pell Grant, that if we're to seriously invest in improving equity across the pipeline, then it means also making sure that students who are being recruited into education pathways, into educator preparation programs, have the additional Pell Grant monies, that are incurring less loan debt at the end of the day, that they're able to go through an educator prep program that is going to address inequities in the system. And I think that is a simple fix that could be done and achieved if we essentially put the right dots politically together in that regard.
Thank you. B.
So I'm going to change it a little because I can't necessarily, give you what I think. I'm going to share with you more so of a question for you to consider as policymakers. And that question would be, what is needed to connect those dots, right? What is needed when you look across and 1 in 5 of our K-12 students are Latino? So what does that mean for HSIs? What does it mean to connect the dots when about 2% of the teacher workforce is, male and Latino? And I think it's 5%, but correct me if I'm wrong, in terms of just overall Latinos as teachers. So what does that mean? And what do we need to do as policymakers to connect those dots, to get that infrastructure, to get those teachers into the classroom, to get those students ready and prepared to make the decision to go into either a 4-year or a 2-year institution, and not just to get into the institution, but to be supported all the way through degree attainment.
Provocative. Ask her the question, she gives it right back to me. I like it. That's good. All right, nice. Well done, V. Okay, so our colleagues have put a lot on the table. I hope if you would raise your hands if you have a question. We have our colleagues that will bring a mic to you and go forward with that overall. Who's going to? Yes. Okay. Thank you. If you would please identify yourself so that we know, and then please go ahead. I was just trying to talk while you gave the mic out. Identify yourself and where your background, and then ask your question. Please do make it a question. If you're going to pontificate in return, we would have had you on the panel. So I want you to ask questions to our panelists. Okay. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Michelle. I'm a CHCI Health Graduate Fellow. My question is regarding the term intentionality. I know it was mentioned a lot in this conversation. So I'm wondering how can Hispanic serving institutions both include and measure internationality, since metrics and measures are very important when seeking grants. So I just was wondering if anyone can elaborate on that.
Great. Will, you want to get started, and then I'll have you and B. Okay, please.
I mean, I look at Gina Garcia's work. I think that she has really kind of written extensively on this, talking about the concept of servingness and what it means to be a serving institution versus an enrolling institution. Deborah does a lot of work on this as well. And so she's developed a framework looking at a number of different metrics and at levels institutionally around not only faculty, but services, curriculum. And so I would tap Gina Garcia's work, and I think she's done probably the most extensive work nationally on what it means to be a Hispanic serving institution.
And even then, I know I had this conversation with Gina a few weeks ago about community partnerships. She has an element in serving us as community partnerships, but what's really missing is K-12 partnerships to address the inequities in the K-12 system that feed into the higher ed system, and then double tax HSIs at the end of the day for doing more than their fair share. So it's something to think about also, how we connect the dots and how we also hold especially public institutions accountable for ensuring that there's a better seamless or non-leaky pipeline, if you will.
Good.
And I'm not getting paid for this, but I would also encourage you to look at the framework that Excelencia has put forth of the for the seal of excellence.
We're getting paid.
None of you are, but you didn't say it. So I do think that's 20 years of listening and learning in institutions. How do we understand what is beyond enrollment that we have publicly available data for, and can raise the bar and standards of expectations? I think that's part of what we're trying to do, not in an esoteric way, but one that's concrete. So thank you. I have here, and then I see a hand here and a hand back there. So okay.
Good morning. My name is Frank Reyes. I'm a college board of trustee for the San Bernardino Community College District. I was very fortunate to have gone through the Issues Institute
Yes.
35 years ago. I was involved with a group that actually put the first $12 million in Title V. I met with our congressional people. I can go into a lot of stories, but I'm not going to because I want to ask the question.
Yeah.
Is we really appreciate the fact that Congressman Jerry Lewis put in and Congressman Becerra put in the first $12 million. It's grown from 1995 to now, it's, what is it,
183.
108. That's not enough. My whole point is that I'm now a college board of trustee. We want to make sure that we reflect the composition of the faculty. We are very intentional. I'm now a board member. I was a counselor, moved really, really quick to organize it. Now at our college has the chancellor is Latina, the vice chancellor is Latino, the vice chancellor for the different part, it's a Latina, and then we have an African American. That's when we talk about intentionality. So, but what we want to do is that make sure I can talk for a whole day, but one of the things that we're doing that I think we need to support is capital finance. Capital finance right now in the Department of Education, HBCUs, and we work with them. But we're not going to, being from California, I could be a little bit outspoken. The fact that we're not getting a fair share. Right now, we're trying to get $2 billion to talk about infrastructure for HSIs. The historically black college, and we work with them very well, they're already getting that $3 billion. And you talk about improvement of the universities, the colleges. We want to make sure that HSIs get a fair share so that when our students go to a college, community college, university, they go to an institution that has those opportunities. So when you talk about opportunities, that's where it's at. So we're going to put pressure on the Biden administration and Kamala Harris, which I'm hopefully wouldn't have a chance to meet. And this is a great opportunity for us to really make a difference. So I agree with everything you're saying, including the Department of Education. He's going to be in charge of who gets the money for it once it's approved. We're also working with the congressional leaders, Hispanic caucus, and the different appropriators. We're leaving out that important thing. Politics plays a major role. You talk about education, we can't go anywhere without the support of that. So
thank you, Frank.
you can be the leaders. You can be the leaders like we were.
Okay. Thank you.
And the capital finance program is under AGA, so you could look up the capital finance program, is the one he referenced.
All right. Good. And so let me make that into a question quickly, and then I'll get to you. So Will, you'd mentioned infrastructure as part of it. Have you thought about the role of capital finance, to Frank's point, and what role that can play in the continued development of HSIs?
I mean, I think overall, we need more dollars at every level, and that's kind of what my three policy asks for: more in Pell Grant, more in infrastructure, more pool of dollars for HSIs nationally. And so I think that we need to be thinking at every level.
Great. Thank you. Yes, ma'am. Please. Thank you.
Hi, good morning. My name is Mariel Baluja. I am actually here with Signify Health, not an educational forum, but very passionate about education as a whole. So we talk a lot about investments on HSIs, but my question to you is, what is the investment for those K through 12 partnerships? And how do we get the word across of HSIs to Latino students across the board? Personally, I had no idea that HSIs were a thing when I went to college, and I don't know that many of my other Latino cohorts did either. So what is currently being done to advertise HSIs and encourage enrollment into those institutions?
Great. So maybe I'll start with that part, because I tend to do a lot more work with HSIs. So, HSI is a relatively more new phenomenon, right? And to the point that I think all of our colleagues have made, you can hit an enrollment threshold and not be what we are calling an intentional HSI. So I do think part of the role of the Seal of Excelencia and other things is like, how do we bring attention to those that are intentional in serving and not just those that are hitting an enrollment threshold? Because we want students to go to institutions that are committed to them and can ensure their success. And that is not every HSI. I think, Frank, you mentioned that, but other people have talked about institutions that were only an HSI when it came to getting federal money, but not in their commitment to serving students. So I do think there's that distinction. There are organizations like HACU, Hispanic Association of Colleges and Universities. They represent HSIs, and I know that they are making an effort. I will say we work with workforce, and I think, Cristobal, you mentioned that too. getting employers to understand there's a concentrated enrollment and potential graduates at HSIs, bringing attention to employers, that will help create that loop, because they're going to be going to the institutions that are graduating these students with quality and caliber for the workforce, and that is an amazing way to bring attention to institutions that are HSIs. Yeah, Will, and then
Has been doing some really interesting work looking at different reasons why institutions apply or don't apply for HSI status. Her name is Dr. Stephanie Smith Aguilar, and she's out of Texas. But she actually, there are institutions that don't want the designation. They actually don't want to be categorized as Hispanic serving because faculty, staff, administration may be against it. Maybe that's what was happening in Mexico State, but there are institutions that are declining it. So there are institutions that proudly advertise, we are Hispanic serving, we're serving this community of students. And there are other institutions that take the designation simply for the federal dollars.
yeah.
You know, the one thing of the K-12 conversation, some of us remember the show A Different World, which highlighted an HBCU experience. That show in itself more than doubled the number of applications to HBCUs. Right.
You're aging yourself right there.
I've never heard
I'll
of
just
it.
say, the conversation, even in media, even though there's not enough Latino, Latinx actors represented in media, but the conversation of how we center the HSI narrative and its importance and what its contribution to community is critically important, where we do see great K-12 HSI partnerships. You find a lot of these cases along the border, right? UT El Paso, UT Rio Grande Valley, who have great early college, high school programs from early on who have worked together to ensure that there's these partnerships to even make it possible where, I've had the blessing to interact with graduates who were 19, 20, finishing their bachelor's degree in nursing. I think it's phenomenal. I think it's awesome. And so there's these definitely notes of success when there is these partnerships to essentially improve equity and access and work, closely with K-12 and higher ed partnerships and community college partnerships, and that we see them now in California. We're starting to see them in Arizona as well.
Great.
So I think there are models where we can highlight that partnership and that overall conversation of why HSIs and building that narrative strategically throughout that process.
Right, thank you.
And we're also providing some incentives. So there are other discretionary grant programs at the Department of Education that may not specifically be targeted to minority serving institutions, to HSIs. However, when we run these competitions, we may give additional points to an applicant that partners with a minority serving institution, a Hispanic serving institution, and giving it better odds of getting that, that supplemental funding.
Yeah.
So
Thank
we
you.
are doing some of that as well.
Great, thank you all. Time goes so fast, doesn't it? Crazy. We're at the end of our time. I know we didn't, gentleman who had a question there, I'm sorry. Maybe you can come up to us afterwards, or others that have questions. Follow up, you can get information about each of our colleagues if you want to know more. It's really important that we continue these kinds of conversations. I want to thank our panelists, Elizabeth, Will, Cristobal, B, for that. I'll leave you with a parting thought as you continue the day and as you continue to reflect on the powerful comments by our colleagues. We didn't overtly say this, but equity with a Latino lens is really something we shouldn't apologize for doing. It's not to the exclusion of others, it's a way of making sure we are included in the discussion. And whether we're talking about equal funding or equitable funding, equity can be the goal and focus, and making sure that we are included in a way, when you see the data that our colleagues have shared, is an important way of thinking about public policy. So thank you all for your time. Hopefully this has been helpful. We look forward to continued discussion with you about this issue. Am I saying that we have 5 minutes? I thought you were saying stop, we're done. Huh? So yes, this gentleman here has been patient and waiting, and then, hi Cesar. I'm sorry, I thought you said we had till noon, so okay. That was a great wrap up for now. I'm going back to that, right? Darn it. No, the gentleman in the back with the beard. Yeah, sorry, I don't know your name, so can't say tie, other people have ties, so. Thank you for your patience in that regard, yeah.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Dennis. I'm with Allstate. I have a question, more or less. So once you're already in an HSI, right, in those institutions, what systems or programs can you have to empower students to hold the administrations accountable and not rely on takeovers or protests, right, that we've seen historically make that change? But I'm talking about more internally, like senior officials in schools, right? Not like professors. I understand that there are certain departments that do these things, but how do you get to like the root of the problem to make that change?
Yeah, this is a critical point of transformation. Cristobal, you want to get started? I know we have a perspective.
You're right on that the history of institutional change sometimes has been because students have advocated for that. And that happens still today at HSIs, HBCUs across the higher ed spectrum. That voice is critically important. Sometimes I always kind of feel that we should have more of those kinds of advocacy, activism efforts to really put front and center the needs of students and to ensure that institutions are held accountable, right, to the tuition that those students bring to the table. Right? At the end of the day, we run as a business and function on enrollment, and students should hold their institutions accountable. And in fact, I would say have greater voice to that conversation than any of us, either administrators or faculty, do at the institution side of the house.
Yeah.
So I think that's critically important to address that. But there are definitely numerous examples when it comes to institutions, back to the conversations of the servingness model by Dina Garcia or the seal of excelencia, right? That part of those conversations, you should hold your institutions accountable to lay out a specific plan that addresses not just staff and programming, but also policies that will leverage support for the success of students. Our charter in itself speaks to that. We have to measure ourselves by those who we include and how they succeed. So how are we doing that at every level? What program, what investment, what infrastructure steps are we taking as an organization? And you as a student, or any student anywhere, should hold their institutions accountable at the very end of the day to how they're doing that specifically. And not just like, well, we want you to do something. Lay it out. Talk about its specific plans. And so we know there's models of that, and I think we should do that to a greater degree.
Yeah, let me be specific about this too. Like at Excelencia, we have what we call Presidents for Latino Student Success, right? To affiliate with Excelencia, we have to talk president to president because it's top down as well as bottom up. So to your point about creating space, so it isn't all on the students or all on the faculty, we call them out. Do you want to be a place where Latino students can thrive? And you have to talk to a Latino organization because who best, I mean, the community accountability, I'm going to call you out if you are or not doing that kind of thing. That creates space for the faculty and the others. If you claim, do you want to be a Presidents for Latino Student Success? Show me what you're doing that manifests that. And then you should be looking in the strategic plan. Are you explicit? Are you including students? Now, unlike our colleagues at HBCUs and others created with a mission to serve, part of our focus is, can you articulate that intentionality in some of your work? Is it on your website? Is there something in your strategic plan that says you're making sure Latino students are included and being served well? That's when you call out, or you call out what people are doing it or not. That creates the space for a faculty member to then say, hey, strategic plan says we want more diversity, we want more Latino students. What's up? You're not doing that. And then the last thing I'd say is that start with enrollment management because we are the growth population. And if no other point than enlightened self-interest, institutions know they need to get us in order to meet their goals. That's a leveraged opportunity. It's pragmatic, maybe a little bit crass, but the reality is that that's the leveraged space to say, from an enrollment management perspective, are you working with the community? Do you have faculty and others? If not, let's work with the CBO, another organization that can help you get that where it needs to be if you're committed. And if not, then you've got to call them out for not wanting to do that. I think those are spaces where you don't have to do it alone. This is what we found. So many people we work with are the only ones in their campus that are carrying that torch a las malas. And at the end of the day, it's exhausting. And it's not always fair to those people who might do it at the sacrifice of their own professional career and opportunity to be able to serve their community well. So how do we create that network, that community of common cause, to make sure that our common cause of serving students is front and center? Yeah? Thank you. All right. Thank you all so much for your time. Appreciate it. Thank you, guys.